We are starting this week down a rather remote lane away outside Helston, and tucked in the corner of a field is nothing. Okay, well, maybe it's something, but if there is something there, it's pretty well hidden. And there's a fun electric fence in our way, so on a first visit I doubted myself too much, just clearly can't be done. But having gone away and seen that not only is there definitely something there, but plenty of people have visited it, I came back 6 months later, and this is the entrance to Piskey's Hall, Fogou. If you get down low enough through the brambles, you are greeted with this chamber, and it's over 2,000 years old. Now, the hall in the title might seem to be overstating things slightly. Piskey is cognate with Pixie, so yes, okay, accounting for scale, I guess this could make a good-sized venue for a midweek Pixie Pilates class, or perhaps a Pixie bar mitzvah. There were investigations of this in the 1800s. Iron Age pottery and iron slag were discovered, as well as a pit apparently filled with ashes. There was also the possibility that there was a further, currently buried, passage. Now, if you've been watching this series so far, first of all, thank you. It's been nice to see that we're beginning to get these out to a wider audience, but you might wonder if you've clicked on the right episode, as every monument of the something like 130 places we've seen so far has been pretty much just earthworks. I mean, really not a single stone left in place atop another, even when masonry is involved. And suddenly, at the far end of Cornwall, we have architecture surviving amazingly, actually. This is all a bit sudden. This is what I was getting excited about, and this is not an isolated structure either. A little way down the road, now we couldn't catch this on our first couple of trips as it's closed outside of the months of May to September while it becomes a winter Airbnb for bats. But this is Haligi Fogou, and it's remarkably large. It really goes back a long way. In fact, hit pause on Haligi. I think we need to explore the concept of the Fogou in general, because what the Iron Age hide-and-seek is even going on here? So at a purely cosmetic level, these seem rather similar to many other sites we've seen. I mean, quite early on when we started filming episodes, we did a weekend on Guernsey, and if we flash up some of the dolmens we caught there, yeah, but it's not hard to see the passing similarity with the huge capstone over the door. In fact, to really confuse things, as we got further into Penwith, we came across Treen Passage Grave, and despite being in Fogou country and looking not entirely dissimilar, this is a Neolithic or possibly Bronze Age monument. So yes, the difference is that these structures are from the Neolithic and are funerary monuments. Yeah, there's dissenting voices claiming otherwise, but what usually follows is a less than evidence-based argument from silence, and we don't have time. So as a visitor, you can see how easy it would be to conflate these two types of monument with just a casual glance. But we have a fair idea of usage for Neolithic passage graves and the like. Fogous, on the other hand, I mean, we have some great examples, but use? That, so far, has remained elusive. And just to say, while the Fogou is a specific name for the Cornish variety, elsewhere in the country, you do have other Iron Age structures of the same type. If you see our Orkney episode, you'll know how we inadvertently ended up on an Assassin's Creed side quest for the key to this, just outside Kirkwall. And there's others on the island too. They're known as souterrains, if you can trace the French there, literally sous, below, and terrain, ground. And Scotland has a large number of good examples. Was very excited to catch this one in the middle of a wheat field just a little south of Edinburgh, or these which have either through collapse or excavation been exposed to the air. There's even this great example we call at Drumina Cashel in Northern Ireland, where you can not only see these incredible stone walls, but this souterrain in the middle. So we're going to very much enjoy showing you around these later in the series. But all this is to say, we are not especially short on great examples of these structures, so it may surprise you that really, for now, there's no conclusive evidence for their use. For defense, they're just too small. That's about as defensive as hiding in a cupboard. So, okay, argument's sake, you're hiding underground in a passage too small to fully stand up. Now what, genius? Storage? Well, maybe it's a bit damp, and I mean, elsewhere, people are happy to just dig pits. Like, do you really need to dig and shore up a 20-metre-long passage just to make yourself a larder? Ritual use? Well, sure, maybe that might be the most likely, but that doesn't really get us much further. Hence the long-running joke that ritual use is just a proxy for we have no idea why this is here. So please avoid the urge to be like, hey, I've cracked it, just by looking at a few images for a few seconds. Like, I'm happy to conjecture with friends at the best of times if it's clear that we're just batting a few ideas or pet theories around. But the absolute arrogance to just assume that you've cracked something that the collective body of archaeologists couldn't, by looking at a picture and pondering it for 90-odd seconds? Like, if you hear a knock at the door, it's probably both Dunning and Kruger, and they're both holding baseball bats. Incidentally, I didn't realise these guys are still alive. Like, turns out that paper is only from, 1999, eh? Good work, boys. Anyway, that's Souterrains/Fogous, and back to Halligie. If we look at the plan here, to build these tunnels that stretch, about 20 metres in places, and the fact that they are branching as well. My footage of this is dark. Huge shock there. If you wired up some permanent lights down here, it would probably end up with this green growth that plagues many Scottish passage graves that have been exposed to light. But I don't have some intense flashlight that I brought or portable lighting setup for filming. I'm not in underground settings much, so I'm not really prepared for it. At a couple of points you have these portals, and behind them is described as a creep. I didn't attempt to commando crawl in there, but they're even lower passages, and they end in bedrock, so this wasn't some previous sneaky escape route. Otherwise, the excavations brought up pottery and a chronology of the site that was quite wide, with occupation going back to about the 4 to 300s BC and extending into the 100s AD, with more activity after that, though it appears the Fogou may have gone out of use by this time. You can see some rather sympathetic work has been done on the entrance to aid the passage of visitors. It turns out this part was robbed of stone about 400 to 500 years ago. I'm embarrassed to say that I was so excited about the Fogou, I hadn't clocked that this is in a round. And in my defence, the site about is fairly tree-covered, such that the earthworks aren't exactly announcing themselves if you're not looking. In fact, rounds have been a bit of a pain when researching this series. Quick digression. A round is pretty much just a small enclosure, particularly found in Cornwall. A bunch have been excavated, but I can scarcely find one that's out in the open to photograph, clearly. Hence, rather frustratingly, I don't have any to show you. And to really confuse things, this is also a round and a type of structure particular to Cornwall, and I get how hill forty this looks, but don't get too excited. This is medieval. It's a sort of amphitheatre where they perform what are called miracle plays. So all good and well, but it's been a right pain trying to get more info on rounds, the small Iron Age type, and instead being constantly linked back to these. Genuinely, if some of you know a round that is good to photograph, and I'm not going to have to sneak onto someone's land to see it, please do comment below, because it's been kind of shocking how few of these are available to see, or at least see well, like not covered with trees and bushes or whatever. Elsewhere, seeing small enclosures is entirely possible, but for this particular morphology, I was coming up puzzlingly short. Anyway, it at least adds much needed context to the Fogou, that this is a subterranean structure within an enclosure. It's not just being randomly dug into a field, as the 21st century setting might suggest. Okay, well, there's more Fogous to come, but moving a little bit to the west. It's funny how this has worked, actually. The last episode on Cornwall was just hill forts and promontory forts, and all of this more exotic architecture has ended up in this second, more westerly part. It's not a deliberate attempt to build suspense on my part, it's literally just geography. And we're about to get into the Courtyard settlements, which are just astonishing when compared to the Iron Age remains we've got used to. And it has to be said, this is not because of what everyone was building in the Iron Age, but rather how. We've been flashing up images of the wonderful Butser farm and other recreated sites. This is a good approximation of what an Iron Age community would have looked like across much of Britain. But this is why what we have to explore today in the 21st century is mainly grassy banks and ditches. It comes down to what has survived, and all of the ancient wood and thatch out of which these places were built has long melted away, leaving just the footprint of what people dug. At least for us casual visitors who are not undertaking like an archaeological dig. But in a few places where the use of stone was necessitated or even preferable, the stone-built structures of the Iron Age still stand in what seems near miraculous levels of preservation compared to what we've become accustomed to so far. It's quite incredible whiplash. I recall reading Barry Cunliffe, and it's a weird experience. It's kind of like, right, so we've got traces in the ground here in Sussex, and then this
massive stone edifice in Shetland.
Oh, and then there's this faint trace in Dartmoor. It's like, wait, wind back the tape a minute. What was that? Anyway, Not to show favouritism, because once again, this is a question of survival bias. But it does feel like an incredible treat, having spent all this time with ditches and features cut into the chalk, to suddenly get down to Cornwall, and as well as hill forts in the form we're used to, we have settlements and other structures made of stone and sitting there, some shockingly intact. So, this is Chaizoyster, and what a place. For context, right before this series began, I made an episode ranking some of the most underrated ancient sites in Britain, and I put this at number 1, not least because, who among your friends knows this is here? I mean, if lots of them do, you might have some really great friends, but my goodness, this site where you can step into Iron Age dwellings and the ruins aren't just like the height of your ankles. Oh, and I'm modestly comfortable with the pronunciation close to Chaizoyster, considering on paper at least it looks like someone transcribed a sneeze. So what are we seeing here exactly? It's between 8 to 10 residences that we can identify. The type of house here is what's called a courtyard settlement. So there's an open area in the centre, and then off to the side, these chambers would have been thatched. You can see this great model from the Truro Museum. We are fairly confident with the depiction of the side rooms having thatched roofs, as had they been tiled, for example, we would find a bunch of those in the archaeology after the roofs collapsed. While we have a patchwork of small Bronze Age farms in the landscape, I mean, Chaizoyster is surrounded by Bronze Age field systems, these were often unenclosed. But this village community is clearly a significant step up. We are a little uncertain about its exact foundation. Elsewhere, it appears courtyard houses may have been built in the footprint of earlier dwellings. What we're seeing here is late 1st century to late 3rd century AD. But here's the thing, did you catch it? This village reached its height and thrived for something like 200 years while the Romans were controlling Britain. Now, I'm not sure the impact of this will hit people, so let me restate that while the Romans were forcibly and not infrequently violently reshaping Britain, life at Chaizoyster is continuing pretty much uninterrupted. And at the risk of making an overgeneralizing joke here, archaeologists who are excavating sites from around the Iron Age, when you come across a rectangular stone structure, it's pretty much, oh, okay, here are the Romans. And yes, I mean, certainly, extant Roman ruins in Britain, not hard to spot. Straight, neat lines. And compare that to the curvy, somewhat irregular forms of the courtyard houses. Now, as Miles Russell would be quick to point out, for example, no, just because the Romans are in Britain does not mean that the entire population has been dressed in togas and dropped into villas to speak Latin. Yes, vernacular architecture would have continued outside of the main towns, though, as we've stressed time and time again in this series, almost none of the Britons are in hill forts when the Romans get here. The hill forts are mostly a relic of a bygone generation. By AD 43, a majority would have been abandoned for something like 100 years. But all this does raise a question. So Chaizoyster and many other settlements visible here in Penwith show a population that is basically left to crack on with what they're doing. So what is going on? Why are the Romans not more active in Cornwall? Now, you'll pardon me, I stated this quite crudely and inaccurately in the thumbnail. That's just the nature of YouTube. Yes. If I may just briefly indicate just how significant this question is, alongside my regret that I'm having to only summarize what we know. Let's just recap a second. As you head west, the last major Roman civitas is Isca Dumnoniorum. That's Exeter to you and I. But it is still a long way from Exeter to Penwith. I mean, even just marking the distances from Exeter to Dorchester to Winchester to Chichester, if we just hop from Civitas to Civitas a second, they average out, it's about 50 miles between each, give or take. Exeter to modern-day Penzance is more than double that, so what gives? In a manner quite unlike anything in southern Britain, the Romans seem bafflingly hands-off with Cornwall. So, okay, to get the most obvious out of the way, no, it's not that the Romans are not in Cornwall at all. Thanks to work that came out of Exeter University just a couple of years ago, we now know that the road network did continue west of the Tamar. And as you can see, this is a field in which our understanding is growing year on year. At this point, we know of 3 Roman forts and 1 villa in Cornwall. But, one fort is at Calstock, just over the Tamar, another near Restormal, and the most significant fort was just outside Bodmin. So, there's no concerted effort to subdue the whole area. Interestingly, by the way, the villa was far further to the west, near Camborne. It was built out of mainly local materials, and might have been considered a little rustic compared to the villas going up elsewhere in Britain. Also, I feel entirely confident to state it's not from a Roman inability to conquer Cornwall. If you look at their campaigns into Wales, that is just more hostile in every way, in elevation, climate, the disposition of the population, the difficulty of maintaining supply lines in the interior. I mean, no offence, Cornwall, but you are not harder to conquer than Wales. In fact, the Romans had prided themselves on how their navy had been instrumental in subduing the Bretons on the other side of the Channel. So even if a land campaign would have presented problems, which it undoubtedly wouldn't, they could have supported it with an amphibious campaign. So let's rule out inability. This does appear to be a conscious choice. Now, if I sounded like I was building to a firm and satisfying conclusion, I must disappoint all of you. This is far from clear. One of my highlights from the year, when we were talking to Miles Russell earlier in this series, he makes the interesting point that the Roman campaign appears to stall out in Dorset. Now, we are dealing with written sources that give us nowhere near the amount of detail we'd like, but it appears that they're running into a landscape full of fragmented, smallish communities, and this is not really what they want at all. You've got no all-out pitched battles to be fought, which is what the Romans really want, as they're pretty much unmatched in the field. The inverse of Cornwall not being impossible to conquer must also be true, that the military threat it posed to the Romans' gains in the south of Britain must have been minimal. I mean, the Romans absolutely were not taking the same chance with Wales, but you can bet if they could have just cleanly and simply set up a network of client kings in Wales with, just a few forts around the landscape, they would have happily done that in place of the decades of attritional fighting that took place instead. But regards Cornwall, it doesn't have to have been a relationship characterized by aggression, suspicion, or intimidation. In fact, a much more amicable agreement seems very plausible. The mineral wealth of Cornwall, with its tin and other metal, had already made it one of the most outward-facing places in Britain. Trade regularly passed from its shores across the Channel, down the Bay of Biscay, through the Pillars of Hercules, and into the trade networks of the Mediterranean. So it is entirely possible that trade arrangements with communities in Cornwall pre-existed with the Romans before AD 43. And this may have been enough to negotiate a settlement where Cornwall, an area otherwise non-threatening to Rome's interests, could be largely left with a degree of autonomy to just keep trading as before. Now, if all of this sounds a bit loose and speculative, well, no kidding. While I've been very much enjoying the Cornish Iron Age and beyond, this is not the Roman series, which we will one day make. In the short time I have to get these made, I feel underprepared to explore or adequately characterise the Roman presence or lack of presence in Cornwall in any great depth. But I also feel like the above is a fair summary of what we know and what we don't. In either case, places like Chisoyster are the result of this ostensibly amicable dynamic, a surprisingly well-preserved example of a community in Britain continuing into the Roman era largely unaffected. So all that said, probably don't read too much into the wider picture with this, but at some point between about 2 to 300 AD, Chisoyster was abandoned. And we have no idea why. I mean, there's no obvious burn layers or signs of a violent episode. Perhaps the occupants just moved on. It could have housed up to about 8 to 10 families at its height, so about 50 to 70 people is an estimate. Oh, and we couldn't be at Chisoyster without mentioning its Fogou. In its current state, it seems a lot less exciting than many of the other examples we're seeing, but there is a Fogou here. Granted, there's a grate, and it's rather filled in, which is sad, since apparently it was originally 16 metres in length, but, it took some damage in the 1800s. And there's only a certain number of Fogous in Cornwall, so I'm not sniffing at one that is still at least partially extant. Another piece of the puzzle, and just a shortish way from Chisoyster. Now, it has to be said that while Chisoyster is run by English heritage and has parking and excellent access and all the rest, the neighbouring hill fort is pretty well hidden, considering. It also does enjoy public access, but you have to park somewhere, walk down the road, and at a very specific point turn up this footpath, walk up the hill away, take in the glorious Cornish countryside, keep walking past the entrance to a modern mine, then take a sudden, and if I recall, unmarked right turn, and this is Castle Andinas, which has a delightful habit of starting arguments and comments. Actually, that's not Castle Andinas. This man is a fraud. Castle Andinas is over here. Guys, hill fort names are not that original. There is more than one Castle Andinas, which really just means castle, the castle. But for all my enthusing about intact Iron Age Cornish architecture, I hope folks would take a pause seeing this like, that seems not quite right. So yes, this is a rather attractive folly from the 1700s called Roger's Tower. I actually quite like this. I wouldn't massively mind, except, well, if you peer closer under the undergrowth covering the site, you can see, oh, stone ramparts. That's awesome. Wait a minute, you didn't. So yeah, somewhat less in favour of destroying the monument for your little garden ornament here. There's actually 4 ramparts, but, well, Rampart 1, I think I can just about see, but it's only really perceivable in the south, in the middle of the enclosure. 2 and 3 are the strong stone-built layers, and 4 is mainly just an extra layer visible to the north. There's no evidence it continued round all the way. But, yeah, okay. I can't find any dating information on this. It doesn't appear archaeology has been undertaken. Well, that is unless you include a large dig that... Ugh. Yes, the neighbours are having some work done, and it's been a bit disruptive. Yeah, what makes me sort of sad, both historical and current mining work around the area has made it a little hazardous for people to just tramp around the countryside completely at will. I mean, I feel otherwise making a major visitor trail where you can walk from Marazion and St Michael's Mount to finish up at Castle and Dinas with its glorious view over the bay. Yeah, it's probably not happening though. I can't tell if there's a permissive path via Higher Trenowen Farm, but there's no attempt to encourage people along this route, certainly. The way I described from the southwest appears to be the main intended route. Anyway, in the absence of dating information, it also does prevent us from making inferences about its relationship to Chai's Oyster, which is just a short distance away. Like, were they contemporary, or did people move to Chai's Oyster from the fort? It's unknown. But I'm really glad to have made it this one. It's more than a little bit out of the way to reach, so you have to really carve out a modest chunk of time to get there, but really worth it when you do. Okay, well, a short distance away is another courtyard settlement, but Chai's Oyster, it is most certainly not. I mean, in theory, this is the Bodrifty Courtyard settlement. I think we're going to need a diagram. This was in summer and the foliage was obscuring much of the site, but if I point to some features, you can maybe start to make out some of the hut circles. There's actually been quite a lot of work here. There were 5 seasons of excavation here in 1951 to 55, and that uncovered not only all sorts of finds, so pottery sherds, sling stones, we also have a good chronology for the site. Now, there's all sorts happening in this landscape in prehistory, from the partly collapsed Mulfra Quoit on the hill just above, to the just about visible barrow here, just to the north of the site, with some traces of Bronze Age activity. The initial phase of occupation was probably between the 4 to 300s, when it was unenclosed and surrounded by fields. Later, in the 100s BC, it appears to have been resettled, an enclosure was put around the site, and some of the original hut platforms were reused. So yeah, apologies, it's not the easiest to see, but there it is. Now, it feels weird to be hitting pause here, as we've still not got through that many sites. I swear this was not supposed to be a The Hobbit, The Battle of 5 Armies scenario. I said Cornwall was going to be 2 episodes, but there was a lot I wanted to cover, and particularly the issues arising from these new types of sites we're finding towards the west end of Cornwall and Penwith. And by the time we got through the script, it was upsettingly long, and we still haven't talked about Tin or Pythias, like I haven't forgotten. So not to mention more courtyard settlements, more Fogous. Believe it or not, this is the place to hit pause. And we need to also catch up on what's happening with the series. We've got some news and we need to take some time to do that too. And I've got to get this cut together before a trip. So with all of that, you are getting 2 modest length episodes instead of 1 monster episode. I will say though, while we do occasionally still attract derision and scorn from, well, it's people who've never attempted anything close to what we're doing or get a bit pearl clutchy at music happening in the background, like, oh, electronic music, how beastly awful, oh, oh, which I never cease to find endearingly pathetic. Like, guys, we've had electronic music in its current form for like 40 plus years. You really thought we'd be running Sgt. Pepper behind all of these? And yet there have been so many people who've been incredibly kind and generous about the episodes. I continue to be surprised and thrilled at how much enthusiasm and affection there is for hill forts and other ancient sites out there in the British landscape. And also, I've been getting suggestions for other sites that we haven't been able to make it to. I am plotting future endeavours. At the moment, we'll probably have to prioritise sites heading further north, whether it's Wales, Gloucestershire, Shropshire and up into Scotland. though. I don't know. If by saying this I will somehow manifest it, there's a graphic in the incredibly thick Trevelgue Head book I mentioned last time, and it shows all the promontory forts in Cornwall. Now, we've hit some of these, generally prioritising the ones with the most prominent ramparts. Yeah, that's kind of been our approach with the series anyway, but gosh, some sort of walk around the entire perimeter of Cornwall along the southwest coast path to see these. Now, that is a very tempting idea for an episode, so I don't know, maybe at some point in the future. Anyway, huge thanks to everyone for their kind words so far, and if you have been enjoying the music in the background, it's ours. We make all the music for these episodes, and you can catch it on bandcamp.com. That's the most tangible place you can support us as a channel, but you can also follow us on Blue Sky. We can post a bit more regularly there, whereas these episodes do take about 20 to 30 hours to make on average. On Blue Sky we're posting much more regularly, so we'll be back for part 3 of our Cornwall episode. Otherwise, have a great one and see you very soon.